Thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Megan Sorensen. I'm Director of Development and Communications here at the Robert H. Jackson Center. And tonight we're privileged to have the Honorable William J. Hochul Jr. with us. Mr. Hochul is the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of New York. In this position, he's responsible for overseeing the prosecution of any federal criminal case brought within the 17 counties of Western New York. The office also represents the United States in all civil matters brought within this territory. Mr. Hochul graduated cum laude from the University of Notre Dame and earned his law degree from UB Law School. He began his legal career in the Washington, D.C. area as a law clerk to a Maryland Court of Appeals judge before joining the litigation section of a large international law firm, where he represented a wide variety of clients in complex civil litigation matters, including racketeering and fraud-related lawsuits. Mr. Hochul joined the Department of Justice in 1987 as an assistant United States attorney for the District of Columbia. And while in Washington, Mr. Hochul prosecuted an extensive array of criminal cases and later specialized in the prosecution of first-degree and gang-related murder cases. In 1991, he joined the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of New York. Mr. Hochul prosecuted a large number of cases involving notorious violent and white-collar criminals, racketeering and other complex schemes, and multiple cases targeting violent street gangs and emerging international organized crime groups. He became the chief of the office's anti-terrorism unit following September 11th, 2001, and chief of the National Security Division in 2006. While in these positions, Mr. Hochul served as lead prosecutor in several high-profile international terrorism cases, including the highly successful prosecution of the internationally known Lackawanna Six. Mr. Hochul has received numerous awards and recognition for his work. He's married to United States Congresswoman Kathy Hochul and is the father of 2 grown children. Following Mr. Hochul's brief presentation, he'll be interviewed by Greg Peterson, president of the Robert H. Jackson Center. There will be an opportunity for audience Q&A following this interview, and please join me in welcoming Mr. Hochul.
What a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much, and thank you, Greg, and all the board members from the Jackson Center, and thank you also, those of you in the audience, for braving what looks like it's going to be the first snow of this season. I've got to tell you, though, that this is really an honor for me, as grateful as I am for the invitation, the opportunity to speak before you. I'm also humbled, because Robert Jackson, to me, is somebody that has been an inspiration. Long before I was a lawyer, I studied the works and the trials of some of the masters. As a matter of fact, I still have a volume on the Nuremberg trial. And Jackson's opening and closing statements were generally regarded, at least in that day, and I can tell you still to this day, as probably some of the finest oratorical presentations that have been given by an American trial lawyer. Just to give you a further idea, I put him almost in the same league as Daniel Webster, who's also quite a inspiration to me when it comes to trial abilities and trial talents. And the other thing that Jackson is perhaps best known for, the Nuremberg prosecutions, is an area that I've also spent a little bit of time in, because the contemporary threat that we have faced from the international movement, Al-Qaeda and affiliates, is not unlike some of the threats that Jackson faced when he was a Nuremberg prosecution. Threats that consisted not only of the possibility of violence, certainly the danger that in some cases could have been on an existential level had the Nazis been able to develop perhaps the nuclear possibilities that the United States fortunately beat them to. But also the whole propaganda movement that our current adversaries seem to promote, both now over the internet, which is the modern means of communication that wasn't known in Jackson's day, But then also with just the traditional media, there's even a magazine, as an example, that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had been publishing called Inspire. And perhaps of direct relevance is the time that I have spent prosecuting international terrorism cases in what we would call Article III courts, United States district courts, and of course, Jackson, being a Supreme Court justice, was at the highest level of the federal judiciary. We're finding that there's substantial debates going on the floors of the Senate and the Congress over whether courts are even equipped to handle today's contemporary threats, such as international terrorists, or whether they should instead be whisked to a place and tried in an area or an environment most often represented by Guantanamo Bay. And most folks may not know that Jackson did more than just prosecute the Nazi threat at Nuremberg. He actually wrote some cases and sat on others that spoke about the role of government and the need to prosecute people, sometimes not just for acts, but also for attempts to motivate a crowd to commit violence. And as a justice, as a lawyer, he certainly sets a very high standard. As a matter of fact, you heard the introduction, I'm a United States attorney. Jackson actually had reached the pinnacle of the Department of Justice, where I serve, and that was as Attorney General of the United States. So at every stage of his career, he's somebody that I look to and I continue to look to, frankly, for guidance as to how I can best serve you as your United States attorney. What I would like to do in the few minutes I have just to speak to you in this format is talk about some of these threats that we're facing in Western District of New York. Let me begin with terrorism, and perhaps at the end of this particular phase and after then the interview phase of our evening, we can open it up back and forth and take this conversation exactly where you like, because that would really be perhaps even better than the particular positive feelings I already have just by being in this same environment that so many of Jackson's finest accomplishments are memorialized and housed. Well, when it comes to the threat of terrorists, most people know of the Lackawanna Six, which was one of the cases that I had prosecuted over the years. And by way of background, that was the first known instance of American citizens leaving the shores of the United States to train with Osama bin Laden. The case was significant for a number of reasons, not least of which was the fact that we caught people that had aligned themselves with a foreign power, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And if you remember, there was an authorization for the use of military force, which Congress passed shortly after 9/11, which really gave the president the power to use all force necessary against nations, organizations, and individuals that aided the terrorist attacks. Well, fortunately, a decision was made at the highest levels to bring that case to court. And as you know, all of the Lackawanna Six defendants were convicted, and they all were sentenced to between 7 and 10 years in jail. What isn't known sometimes, however, is that each of these men ended up cooperating with the government. And by cooperation, I mean not just debriefings and sitting with agents such as Special Agent Brent Isaacson of the FBI, but also, frankly, in testifying in cases throughout the world. All of my remarks, by the way, are going to be referring to matters of the public record. I may be able to connect some dots for you. Chances are you didn't have access to all the world's newspapers, but just I need to say that kind of caveat because one of the other developments in the law of fighting terrorists post 9/11 was the breakdown of what we sometimes call the wall. there was a wall before 9/11 that actually separated law enforcement officers, such as the FBI, all federal law enforcement, and all state, local, and county officers. They were on one side of the wall, and they received and developed information that would help prosecutors such as myself put people in jail. But as you may know, the war against terrorists takes place on a number of levels. There is that homegrown, home law enforcement function to fight terrorists, identify and neutralize threats. But then, of course, we also rely as American citizens on our military forces and our intelligence community, which is quite robust once you leave our shores. With the breakdown of this wall post 9/11, for the first time, all the information that was accumulated by the intelligence community, all of the leads and evidence that's developed by military components, and yes, all of our state, local, county, and federal law enforcement officers not only were encouraged to share information, they were required to share information. So sometimes people that are involved in the fight against terror have a lot of stuff in their minds, and they are not permitted to talk about stuff that's been classified for various security reasons. So my remarks, I need to say, will be referring to things that are of a public record nature. But getting back to the story of the Lackawanna Six, these folks all testified, cooperated, provided leads, provided debriefings, and really gave most of the Western powers who fight terrorists as our allies unique insights as to how the indoctrination process was conducted, the infiltration and exfiltration process of how somebody goes about attending one of these terrorist training camps, and then actually identifying the sort of ideas and training that was being promoted at the time our Lackawanna Six people were in attendance at this terrorist training camp known as Al Farouk. And the one thing I'll say in not arguing for or against criminal courts to prosecute terrorists versus the Guantanamo Bay model or the commission model or the Nuremberg trial model is this. There was, in fact, another man at the same time as the Lackawanna Six guys were being prosecuted, who in fact was prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced during the Guantanamo Bay Military Commission process. And of course, the person I'm speaking of is Salim Hamdan, who was the driver of Osama bin Laden. Now, what you need to know, and it's probably common sense, but we should just elaborate a little bit for purposes of this talk, is that not just anybody can be selected to be the driver of Osama bin Laden. He did not use cab drivers or anybody other than a person who would have been a highly trusted, highly placed within the organization member of Al-Qaeda. Salim Hamdan, after trial, after conviction, and with all of this evidence of his role as the driver of bin Laden, he was sentenced and served 5.5 years in jail. 5.5 years in jail. The Lackawanna Six defendants, on the other hand, whose conduct consisted of training with and only spending between 2 weeks and at the outside 6 weeks with Osama bin Laden, and then who came home from the United States and simply stopped or terminated their involvement in the organization, and who, by the way, cooperated fully even after conviction and sentencing, the least one of those defendants received was 7 years in jail, and others received as much as 10 years in jail. Now, we can argue whether or not what a driver does day in and day out as a bodyguard, if you will, for Osama bin Laden should receive a certain amount of time or not, or whether maybe there should even be a different punishment for somebody who serves in that role. But I think all of us would agree that if you're going to sentence somebody who spent 10 days training with Osama bin Laden to 7 years, the driver should at least do a bit more than that. And I think that that can serve as a very good example and a very good model of one of the deficiencies of the commission system. Because what happens, particularly if you look at the original authorization of military force, is that the president can use force against nations, organizations, or individuals who were responsible for the terrorist attacks. What do you do for those who aid the organizations? Maybe they weren't even part of the organization at the time of the terrorist attacks. And for most recent examples, you probably are familiar with a man by the name of Anwar el-Awlaki, a particular person who was born in New Mexico, a United States citizen, but then traveled to Yemen and remained there until, according to the newspapers, he was recently found and was, if you will, on the business end of a Hellfire missile. Similar to Samir Khan, a person who was a propagandist and who was one of the authors, if you will, of this Inspire magazine. Do they fit under the original authorization for use of military force? And even when you get to the trial, if there is one, what sort of evidence, what sort of legal liability theories does somebody use? In the criminal courts that I've spent my whole career spending prosecuting cases in, and then also serving as a private lawyer, ideas such as conspiracy are very well known. Evidentiary rules as to what evidence can be presented, what evidence is excluded, very well known. Even when it comes to sentencing law, there's a whole book since 1986 which talks about what kind of punishment people that are accused and convicted of any number of crimes, actually all of the crimes, where the judge should begin to look and what sort of quantity of jail time should he think about imposing in a mine run, or what we would sometimes call a typical criminal case. Not so when it comes to commissions and judges there, because there's frankly been so little work done on that. We, of course, know about Nuremberg and how that turned out. And I understand that Justice Jackson was frankly even surprised by some of the sentences that were imposed by the judges. And then I guess the last piece is this. If in fact it is the country that's at war against terrorists, I, for one, strongly believe that the American citizenry should weigh in on what should be the fate of these terrorists. And the way our citizens do that under our system of justice is the jury trial. In a military commission, the jurors are picked in a different way, and there always is the possibility of an acquittal. At Nuremberg, I understand 3 men were acquitted, but we are certainly coming up to the point now where there may be, no ifs, or ands, or buts, the opportunity to decide for future cases. Do they go commission? Do they go criminal trial? And now you know, you have a little bit more information, I hope, by which you can evaluate what would be the right approach. As a matter of fact, just 2 weeks ago, Umar Abdul Muttalib, the underwear bomber who was trying to blow up Flight 253 as it was landing in Detroit on Christmas Day 2009, he just was convicted of providing material support. One of many ways in which we can hold people in jail and sentence them for doing something on behalf of al-Qaeda, even if, as was the case of Umar Abdul Muttalib, he had nothing to do with the attacks of 9/11, but much, much later, 8 years later, joined the ideology, if you will, and then attempted to kill all those Americans. So that is the sphere of terrorism. It's highly nuanced, many complexities, and it's an area that we consider of #1 priority, certainly in Western New York. And by the way, just before you think that that's all the terrorist cases we have, over the years since 9/11, we had cases involving money going to a terrorist recruiter in the country of Yemen. We had a case, another financial type case of money going to the country of Lebanon with the understanding that it was going to be aiding Hezbollah, which is another terrorist group and in the news quite a bit. And we even had a prosecution involving somebody who lied about a particular attempt to travel to Israel and commit a suicide operation. So lots of work that we do. And when I say we, I've got to say that the leading law enforcement agency is certainly the FBI. And the FBI just is working around the clock in order to keep all of you safe, along with your local partners, local law enforcement officers, county, state, and other federal agencies. We all meet on what we call the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and it's not just a matter of connecting dots. Frankly, it's a matter of getting even more dots from all of these agencies and all of these leads so that we can get a better picture to keep you safe. The fight against terrorism, though, I recognize could be a little abstract for us here in Jamestown, New York. So let me just spend the last couple of moments talking about something that really is a more realistic and contemporary and serious threat to you all here at the Jackson Center. There are any number of criminals that we have been prosecuting over the years that I've been United States Attorney that generally involve the attempt to do one of three things. And I could even perhaps more specify to say that it's criminals attempting to take one of three things from you. Number one, it's been my perception that criminals like never before are attempting to take your money. Secondly, they're attempting to take your identity. And thirdly, I have seen more and more instances of people attempting to take your children. Your money, your identity, and your children. Let's talk about the money first. There is any number of studies which say that violent crime is going down. It's true at the national level, it's true at the state level. As a matter of fact, if you saw Sunday's Buffalo News story, there was a story about some topic or other that my office is handling. If you hadn't seen it, it involves our targeting violent street gang members who kill people indiscriminately. But that article, buried within that article, was the statistic that while crime statewide has gone down 4%, in Erie and Niagara counties, which is the principal urban areas where we've been really targeting these gangs along with Monroe County, crime has gone down 25%. So tremendous success, and it's statistical, which in today's day and age we all need to know, and frankly in today's age of diminishing resources, we need to have a metric, both as somebody who manages the resources of the office and as you, the taxpayers, what's working, what's not. Should we spend more money in one area, less in another? In the Violent Crime Initiative, we've been successful and things are working well. But the corresponding increase, unfortunately, is in these areas of trying to get your money. And just over the last couple of months, we've sentenced a couple of men who succeeded in stealing over $6 million from people that thought they were investing money with guys that portrayed themselves as very trusted individuals. They had the gray hair, they had the very nice office space, and they said, we will promise you a certain return, trust us. $6 million later, we discovered the fraud and the prosecution ensued. Within the last month, we prosecuted and sentenced two men who had a little bit of a different twist on how to steal your money. They had insiders who worked for credit companies, and they were able, with this insider knowledge, to find people that had recently paid off some of their credit debts. They then obtained the names of these people who had had credit outstanding but had now paid it off, and they targeted these men and women across the United States for further contacts. And in this case, they were told that, you know that debt you just paid off, you actually owe more, 1,000 more, 2,000 and more. And they trusted on the fact that many people don't really monitor their credit, their debts, credit cards, who knows, bank loans. And if somebody sounded plausible enough, they were able to convince that potential victim to part with more and more of this hard-earned money. As a matter of fact, this strategy worked so well that there were over 1,026 victims that succumbed to this kind of pressure. And it was always followed up with, and if you don't pay, the sheriffs are on their way. It was a very ingenious plan that Arendt and Winzikowski had developed, but fortunately it was thwarted, but not before a lot of heartache, and the sentencing hearings were just highly emotional as person after person testified about the devastating consequences sometimes of believing the person at the other end of the phone really was a bona fide credit representative. Another example. And then we've had other cases where people have hired different kinds of actors even, always with an idea to get your money, to buy a product for more money than it was worth, to say that your check was lost even though it wasn't, sometimes promising you that you won your own award for $1 million. We're going to send the $1 million to your account. Just give us your account information. And then just send us also a $10,000 check very quickly, and then that'll cover our postage and handling. And of course, the money wasn't really ever there. It was just all fictitious money. But once they had your credit or your bank account information, they cleaned you out. So you have to be very, very careful. And what we have tried to do, along with our state and local federal partners, is actually send people to a website called www.stopfraud.gov that will provide you countermeasures, different kinds of indicia of when something's fraud and when you need to be careful and how you can do your due diligence. Because in law enforcement, it's hard to catch every single criminal. As a matter of fact, when I was in college, a criminology teacher said that the best law enforcement agency only catches about 10% of the criminals. The others, hopefully, will eventually go straight if they see that there is a substantial enough punishment. Then there's this deterrence value, and you don't have to convict everyone. So we know we can't get everybody. You're your own best defense. Similar to theft of money, though, is theft of identity, and it does have to do with this whole new world we're in of social media. You would not believe the information that's available over the internet. Everything about who you are, very private information to include potentially license information, social security information, dates of birth. And one thing that I learned, similar to the Lackawanna Six, where people who had been convicted then share information with law enforcement and we all learn from it, I had the opportunity once to talk to Frank Abagnale. How many of you know who Frank Abagnale is? He was played by Leonardo DiCaprio in a movie called Catch Me If You Can. And Frank Abagnale was a certain young man, I don't know if he went to college, who was able to assume different persona, including a doctor, an airplane pilot, lots of other roles. And in those roles of taking somebody else's identity, he lived a pretty good life until he was ultimately tracked down by law enforcement. In the movie, it was played by Tom Hanks. And afterwards, he was convicted, sentenced to jail, and began to cooperate with the government. He cooperates to this day. And what Frank Abagnale said is that people are just simply too careless. Putting aside the internet, which is a serious concern to those who would like to have a secure identity, the amount of bills that you have that simply go into the garbage without shredding, perhaps those invitations to just sign the back of a new credit card, you look at it, you know you don't want any more plastic, so you throw that away, card and all, number, name already on it. Frank Abagnale said that he could make a fine living if he was so inclined to this day, just by going through garbage that people discard. Well, if something like that is a threat, the internet is 10 times of a greater threat. And just because you get something from an email, just because the email perhaps says Chase Bank, there's any number of ways in which people can spoof different email addresses. And what you think is Chase Bank might really be the bank of somebody else who is living and laughing right now in Moscow, Russia. And he might not get everybody to bite on an invite to join a certain club or to send some intimate information or bank account information, but enough people will. And because he's sitting at his computer terminal, he can send out these phishing attempts just at a striking of his enter button, and it'll go to 1 million people. So you have to be very, very careful with the threat posed by the internet. And when it comes to protecting your identity, our office also maintains some handy tips, and that's available on our website, frankly, some of the things you can do to protect your identity. But last but not least, your children. There are criminals that are attempting to steal not just your children in a physical sense, but really in almost their essence. And what do I mean by that? We see more and more child pornography cases than I would have thought possible. As a matter of fact, we have so many of them, I could probably assign every one of my assistant United States attorneys to do these kinds of cases. And we might not be able to do anything else. But we have had cases just over the last several months of a high school teacher who would use his class to identify potential victims, would then assume a different identity of a teenage girl and begin a dialogue between what seemed to be a teenage girl and a 14-year-old young man, and then slowly progress the conversation to a point where there was images texted, and then once one image was texted, there would be the threat, the pressure that if more wasn't sent, more explicit, then there were going to be an embarrassing episode. These predators are on the internet, and they are formidable. They know the weaknesses of children, the vulnerabilities, and they are preying on them. And we are doing everything we can, not so much to prosecute the possessors, because our state, local, county officials do a wonderful job, like Barry does. And you have Dave Foley, your district attorney. They can use the local statutes on the possessors. But when it comes to the producers, the people that are enticing, the people that might not be in Western New York at all, but might be across state lines, across international lines, that has to be a matter exclusively for our office. And we are working that area very, very diligently. The other way, frankly, people are stealing your children, though, comes with this whole phenomena of prescription pill abuse. I traveled the 17 counties of the Western District of New York. I've met with the sheriffs, I've met with the district attorneys, and to a man and woman, they say that prescription pill addiction or opiate addiction is one of the most challenging and formidable threats they face involving children. And how young are we talking? We're talking middle school, 12 years old and up, are getting involved and unfortunately hooked on prescription pills. It's everywhere. As a matter of fact, it is so common to this area that on Friday we hosted the first of its kind prescription pill summit. Over 500 people attended from all disciplines, doctors, treatment providers, people that handle addiction issues, insurance providers, law enforcement, Barry was at that as well, school officials, and we even had people who had experienced firsthand harm. We had a young girl who spoke about how she had descended from prescription pills into heroin. We had a doctor who lost his license because he became addicted to prescription pills. And we had a father who lost his son, who committed suicide because of this damaging effect of heroin or opiate or prescription pill addiction. So it's there, and we can't pretend it's not. We are doing everything we can to educate the public. Forums such as this, you now know what you have to look out for. You have to go to your medicine cabinets. There's a National Prescription Pill Take Back Day this Saturday. That's going to be, I'm sure, I know you're very active here in Jamestown and in Chautauqua County. Get that stuff out of your medicine cabinet, because the drug dealer, the corner drug dealer, is now your own medicine cabinet. And even if your medicine cabinet has been cleaned and checked. Maybe somebody else's parents or grandparents hasn't been. And that's where it begins, and it descends into heroin. Because on the street, a prescription pill goes for about $1 a milligram. And it's not uncommon to have an 80 milligram pill of hydrocodone or Oxycontin. They go up to about 100 milligram. So you can see it's expensive for anybody to be able to purchase a black market pill and to get the effective high. Heroin, on the other hand, goes for as low as $10 a hit. So it's not long before the addict realizes, I can't afford one kind, there's plenty more I can get from heroin. And once you're into the world of heroin where there is no quality control, there are no standards, and the people that are handling the product are extremely dangerous, then you're into almost a point of no return. And that is the last way your children are being stolen, and that, frankly, is the violence and the gang activity. I used to think that it was confined, since I had spent 10 years prior to the counterterrorism work fighting street gangs here in Western New York. I used to think it was a rare case that you would see a violent gang operating outside an urban area, Rochester, Niagara Falls, and Buffalo being the principal ones. But as we know from just the last couple of months, it has even hit Jamestown, New York. There was, of course, as I was driving in, I passed the town of Ellicott. And you know as well as I do, there was allegedly now, according to our indictment, a contract murder perpetrated right in the town of Ellicott. And just a couple of months ago, there was the largest heroin bust involving any number of traffickers right here in Jamestown. Over $500,000 in U.S. currency was seized, along with multiple pounds of the product. So the violence has traveled, if you will, even to the smaller, formerly quiet communities such as the ones that you all are lucky enough to call home. So we are going to continue to attack that as well. Fortunately, here we do have the Southern Tier Task Force. We have Brent Isaacson, who is based in Jamestown on behalf of the FBI, and violent crime is a priority. And if we can keep kids from getting involved in the violence or even the predecessor, the preceding steps to violence, the heroin, the prescription addictions, even the marijuana usage, which is frequently the beginning of this cycle, then I think all of us as a community will be better. Not so much the terrorist threat, which I recognize is something that is of very, very serious importance and is a priority, but at the local level, at the micro level, the danger to our children, that is of something that keeps me up at night and something I spend a great deal of time with our law enforcement officers prosecuting. So thank you so much for that brief introduction into our office. We worked very hard, and perhaps through some of the questions, we'll be able to share a little bit more with you. Thank you very much.
By the way, you are a studio audience. Thank you for coming. This is what's important over here. Because what we do at the Jackson Center, as so much of it is education opportunities, your presentation was incredible. And that will be aired. We have access to several school systems, and at the same time, that will be an opportunity through local Time Warner Cable to be. So thank you for being a studio audience to our conversation I'm going to have with U.S. Attorney Bill Hochul. Most important question, Rangers or Cardinals?
Well, I don't take a position on something as important as that. I do enjoy baseball, though, and if we can go to a seventh game, I think that would be the best.
Agreed. In April of 2010, there was a picture of you being sworn in as the U.S. Attorney, and there was your family and your two children. A year later, there was another picture of your wife with you looking on adoringly and approvingly with your two children. You are deemed by several sources as between you and Congressperson Kathy Hochul as the most powerful couple in Western New York. How do you kind of live your lives where you're doing such high-profile U.S. attorney work, she's doing very high-profile Congress work?
I've got to tell you, Greg, it certainly is perhaps one of the highlights of my life to have seen my partner of 27 years now ascend to that level. Certainly neither of us began our careers with either the goal of becoming a United States attorney or becoming, in Kathy's case, a congresswoman. So it was something that just evolved or developed. And I think if you had met either of us at a young age, you would be surprised to discover in 2011 that we are at this position. In my case, as I described, I just wanted to be a trial lawyer, and for those reasons studied the life and the cases of Justice Jackson and Daniel Webster. And in Kathy's case, she wanted to work in a supporting role with Congress people and senators. And along the way, I know she had met on numerous occasions such dignitaries as former Congressman Stan Lundeen, who we're fortunate enough to have also on your Jackson board. It is something that caught us by surprise, frankly. We've only been at it 4 or 5 months now, since May. It's frankly something that takes Kathy out of the house a lot more than me. My job is the 17 counties. Kathy is now most often in D.C. But it's exciting for us, and it's certainly rewarding for both of us to have these two positions.
On Monday, April 1st, 1940, and you've referred to that you're being part of the Department of Justice, the top job in that Department of Justice, the Attorney General. Attorney General Jackson gave the following speech to the United States attorneys, who then were serving in each federal judicial district across the country. In the speech, Jackson, who had been Attorney General for only 3 months, offered his views on what constituted proper ethical conduct for federal prosecutors. He said, among other things, it would probably be within the range of that exaggeration permitted in Washington to say that assembled in this room is one of the most powerful peacetime forces known to our country. The prosecutor has more control over life, liberty, and reputation than any other person in America. His discretion is tremendous. He can have citizens investigated, and if he is that kind of person, he can have this done to the tune of public statements and veiled or unveiled intimations. Or the prosecutor may choose a more subtle course and simply have a citizen's friend interviewed. The prosecutor can order arrests, present cases to the grand jury in secret session, and on the basis of his one-sided presentation of the facts, can cause the citizen to be indicted and held for trial. He may dismiss the case before trial, in which case the defense never has a chance to be heard. Or he may go on with a public trial. If he obtains a conviction, the prosecutor can still make recommendations as to sentence, as to whether the prisoner should get probation or a suspended sentence, or after he is put away, as to whether he is a fit subject for parole. While the prosecutor, at his best, is one of the most beneficent forces in our society, when he acts from malice or other base motives, he is one of the worst. This particular letter and speech to federal prosecutors is one which I know is oft quoted. How do you react to this kind of letter that was given 70 years ago?
I'll tell you, that just shows the wisdom and the knowledge of, at that time, Attorney General Jackson, because you do realize that the amount of power you have as a United States attorney is formidable. And you have to be aware that any time we do something in public, it is going to affect somebody's life, their family, for eternity. And I know, speaking for myself and the Assistant United States attorneys in our office, we go over investigations any number of times before we're satisfied there's enough evidence to charge. Sometimes there's I would almost say a disappointment that you see in the papers that somebody a public figure who's been accused by rumor or otherwise to have committed a crime, why isn't that person been charged yet? What is taking so long in the investigation phase? And that is, I think, because our office, federal prosecutors, we take statements such as that very seriously. And we don't bring a case, we don't even ask a grand jury to indict a case, frankly, unless we think we have evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to convict. The standard to charge is probable cause, just a little bit more likely he committed the crime than not. That's what it takes to indict. We don't bring a case and we don't ask to indict. We don't ask the grand jury to charge unless it's evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's one of the ways that we try to guard against the danger and frankly, the improper use of some of the force and some of the authorities we get. The other thing we try to do, frankly, is have accountability. And how do we do that? All of our charging decisions by assisting United States attorneys, first of all, begin with an investigation by a federal law enforcement agency. And even if it's a local crime, and there's no doubt that we help our local partners with crime, we do that all the time as part of a way to identify all perpetrators, not just the ones who may be located here. Every federal agency has its own procedures for opening cases. They just can't open a case because the United States attorney thinks that they would like to harass somebody. Their standards, predication. Then those agents are all sworn law enforcement officers, many of them highly educated men and women who are doing federal law enforcement as a career. They've all taken oaths similar to ours to defend and uphold the Constitution. So a case likely wouldn't even get to our doorstep until it's met this screening process, if you will, by the agency. Even once it's in our house, though, the prosecutor has to write down in a document exactly what the evidence is supporting each charge. And that forces the prosecutor to think through the elements of a crime, make sure there's sufficient evidence, and then to convince two levels of supervisors that his view of the evidence, his view of the facts is accurate, and in fact a violation of law occurred. So it's the accountability, it's the way we divide power in the criminal justice system between prosecutors and investigators. And frankly, one of the most important pieces too is the defense bar. The criminal defense bar in Western New York is exceptional. And they keep us on our toes as well. And if there was any kind of foul play or allegations of misconduct, they bring it to the independent judiciary. And the judges, of course, as you would know, serve life terms. And all of those checks and balances that, frankly, go back to our founding fathers are in use. And I think they guard against some of those sentiments that Justice Jackson was addressing when he gave that speech. But fortunately, that speech lives on. And it is important for us to hear it time and time again in order to realize that we do have this sort of power and we can't misuse it. Because once we do, if the public's respect for what our office does ever declines, then that'll be the beginning of the end, I think, because we all as American citizens trust our law enforcement officers. We should. There's the occasional rogue officer and we prosecute them. And that's rare. It's even more rare to have a rogue prosecutor. But when that happens, we discipline that prosecutor or disbar him. But nevertheless, it has to remain the rare case, and we keep it rare by remembering and commenting and thinking about those very wise thoughts.
Notre Dame, University of Buffalo Law School, criminal law. What's the connector?
Well, I almost got into the criminal law by accident. But then once I was there, it just seemed to fit. My dad was a cabinet maker, and the highest grade he ever went to was 8th grade. he would always say to myself and my two sisters, you don't want to work with your hands the way I have to. So he inspired and insisted on education. My mother, her highest grade was 12th grade. She was a high school graduate. And growing up in the 60s in modest circumstances, it was pretty clear that the highest status people in the town of Cheektowaga, where I was born and raised, and as well as the east side of Buffalo, was the lawyers. I had a lawyer, Mr. Miller, that lived on our street, actually, and that combined with a book I read about Daniel Webster, where in this fictitious story, Daniel Webster argued against the devil. Maybe some of you know the Stephen Vincent Benet story. Inspired me to think that I would want a career as a trial lawyer. So for that reason, I went to law school, as you indicated, and couldn't find a job where I could try a case, because in the 1980s, the practice of law was already beginning to change. Where we are today in the 21st century, trials are somewhat rare. In federal court, our attorneys maybe try 1 or 2 cases a year. In a district attorney's office, they try more cases, but not that many. Trials are kind of becoming a little bit a thing of the past. In the 1980s, that was beginning, and I wanted to try cases. I couldn't get a job in a place where I could try cases. So my first job was with a judge, and I was like, ugh, I gotta wait a year. But at least that job was a good one. It could get me into a law firm where I would have a chance of trying cases. I got to the law firm in 1985, and I had a little whiff of trial work, and I enjoyed it. So then the U.S. Attorney's Office opened up, and the U.S. Attorney's Office of the District of Columbia is like a district attorney's office that Dave Foley runs here, or Frank Sedita in Erie County. We handle local and federal cases and international cases. I began trying shoplifting cases and then simple assaults. And if you did okay at that level, in the criminal milieu, the more serious the crime, the more prestigious the trial. So from simple assault, you would then get into assaults with weapons or simple robberies, and then you would get into attempted murders and then murders. And it, over the course of 2 or 3 years, it just got into my blood where I always wanted to be in a courtroom, trying at least one trial a week. That was a lot. And then the cases just got more and more serious, and then it was, I have to stay doing this. And the reason I ultimately committed my life to it, I think, was in talking with the victims. When I was in a firm, the firm I was in was a very wealthy firm. As a matter of fact, it was the second largest law firm in the United States and at the time. And the lawyers were all very well compensated, and the surroundings were phenomenally opulent. Cut flowers. I don't know if these are cut, but the rugs, hand-woven Chinese Oriental rugs. And I'll never forget my managing partner. He had suspenders that had dollar signs going up and down, and they were very successful lawyers. And I told you I had come from a completely different place. The rest of my life story, frankly, is my dad got sick and had to retire, and we had a very difficult time of it financially. So I had, as a family, I had come from a place of really no money. And here I was thrust into this second most successful or large firm of phenomenal wealth. And it was a very odd feeling for me, just from a psychological place. But I realized that when I started working with some of these victims at trial, wouldn't it be nice someday if a victim who has lost their father, lost their husband, lost everything to a fraudster, and has nowhere else to turn because they're now penniless. They can't hire lawyers. They can't hire fancy law firms. Wouldn't it be nice someday if these victims had just as good of a lawyer, just as formidable a lawyer as are in these big law firms, working for them as a prosecutor? So I stayed, and And I think most defense lawyers would tell you in Western New York that when we go to trial, it's a challenge for them. I hope it is. But you know, that's how I ended up in criminal work. And frankly, I got to tell you, I almost didn't want to get into the violent crime work. And part of that was where I grew up, there were large families, and invariably my neighbors were families of all boys. Big families, 3, 5 boys. The other 2 siblings in my family were girls. I had 2 sisters. And for any of the fellas around here, you might know what that means when you have 2 sisters versus 5 or 6 of the same family about your age, and there's some kind of dispute on the street over whether you can walk on one side of the street or you can't use that sidewalk. So, you know, I kind of didn't necessarily want to go back to this world of street level violence, but I did through now in an official capacity. And it's funny sometimes, and I think about Justice Jackson again in this connection. He was a high school graduate, and I understand his father wanted him to take a different path of medicine, but he felt a calling. And I have no doubt brought all of his talents and all of his life experiences to bear to the point where he became known as perhaps one of the finest trial lawyers ever at the Nuremberg cases, and then also one of the probably the best, most prolific, most erudite writers as a Supreme Court justice. He brought all of those life experiences to give him this unique blend, and that's just another reason why he's an inspiration to me.
Well, that'll make the highlight film. This is very good. You were just a career path-wise, you found yourself Department of Justice, Washington, and obviously back to Buffalo. When does Kathy come into this?
Well, we had met when I was working as a volunteer for a New York State Assemblyman, Dennis Gorski, at the William Donovan office building, by the way, in downtown Buffalo. And Kathy was working for the New York State Assembly Speaker's office in the same building. So we started dating in 1982. 1984, as soon as I graduated and took the bar, we got married. As a matter of fact, depending on the audience, I always describe that as the best summer I ever had, because I graduated from law school, took and passed the bar, got married, and played almost 100 softball games. So
I'm looking at my wife. I think the same thing happened to me.
And
that was one big year.
that was one of the ways Kathy got me to go to Washington. She was already working as an attorney in D.C., and she knew I loved to play softball or baseball before that. And she found this softball team for me in the Capital Region, which was treating the sport almost like a professional league. And I would play with the local guys, you know, just here you go, and then you're done. But it was very exciting in 1984 playing in this environment. But of course, the highlight was getting married. So.
Her tenacity, I read just a little bit about it. She really took on a cause for Ernie Davis at Syracuse. And could you tell a little bit about that story? Because I found that fascinating.
Well, she was in student government, even at the college level. And there was a time when they could name a student union, as I understand it, or maybe it was the football stadium, which was ultimately known as the Carrier Dome. They had to name it after somebody, so Kathy really worked hard to name the facility after Ernie Davis. And in her role, she was a vice president of student government. She learned how to be insistent, and I think those are some of the qualities that she's probably known as now in Western New York. You can't go anywhere with somebody telling you a story as the husband of when Kathy fought for them in some way, shape, or form, and she does not give up. So that might have been the beginning, but also I think it was from her upbringing. She grew up with 4 boys. She and her sister were the only girls, and when you grow up in a family of 6 siblings, and some of them very assertive men in their own right, and young boys. I think you learn how to stick up for yourself. So she did that, both in the Ernie Davis case and in her own growing up years.
You've won several awards and just been commended, a lot of commendations for all of your work in the Department of Justice. Yet you got kind of caught up in a political thing back in 2006, where you applied for counterterrorism position at the Department of Justice, and ultimately was denied, and it led to an inquest by the Department of Justice, by the Inspector General, dealing with Monica Goodling. How did you feel about getting kind of turned down, and you learned that, in fact, this was sort of a political job, and nothing to do with merit?
Well, according to the Inspector General's report, and I'll just confine myself to what the Inspector General found, the job wasn't supposed to be political. What I had applied for was a position to supervise all the counterterrorism programs in the country. And the minimum qualifications for the job as it was posted was 5 years as an assistant United States attorney and substantial experience in counterterrorism. And we, of course, here in Western New York, had some of these counterterrorism cases I had told you about, and I had already, I think, had 16 years in the Department of Justice at that point. And so I applied for this job and didn't get it. Didn't find out till the Inspector General's report that the person who got the job, as I understand it, I think had been a prosecutor for 2 years and had never had any counterterrorism cases at all. So that was a little bit of a surprise. But what the Inspector General said is that this person, Monica Goodling, had done some internet research on candidates for these non-political Department of Justice jobs, and apparently found that Kathy at the time was, might have been the deputy county clerk of Erie County at that point, and had a D after her name. So for that reason, they decided not to have me handle counterterrorism, but to give it to somebody else. Now, it's funny how things work, and almost, I think, a confirmation of my faith in greater power. Turns out that was my mother's last year of her life, and if I had been in Washington, it would have taken me through the time she passed away in 2007, and because I had to continue to stay in Buffalo, I was able to spend a lot of good quality time with her. She wasn't even sick in 2006. She was 86 years old, but you know, no illnesses. So it really ended up being very fortunate, and I also had the opportunity to work on other cases and spend time in Western New York. I loved the job of assistant U.S. attorney, and I wouldn't have left it other than this chance to become the United States attorney. So it all worked out for the best.
You've had some high-profile cases. Talk about, for those who, it was flashback for me, but your case with Donald Sly Green. A little background and kind of a little bit about that. Donald
Green was a man who had already been convicted of murder and was spending what should have been the rest of his life in the Attica prison. And then he was later shifted to a downstate prison facility, which was even more secure, known as Shawangunk. And even though he was in this prison facility, he was continuing to run a drug organization using the prison telephones. And he had brought some very smart, very lethal men to Western New York from both Tennessee and from California. And the folks from California were aware that if you dressed in a certain way, red, that was synonymous with being a blood. And there's reasons gang members wear the gear. Some of it is to identify themselves from others, but there's also an intimidation factor. And Donald Green's crew literally tried to corner the market of drugs in Western New York, and they enforced it by killing anybody that stood in their way, whether they be other drug dealers, whether they be witnesses to their crime. In fact, they would even try to go after law enforcement officers, prosecutors too. And it was a matter where I had spent time in this private law firm you spoke about, and one of the things sophisticated law firms do is they use sophisticated statutes, and racketeering laws are very sophisticated, RICO for short. Nobody had ever used RICO against a street gang before, and I had worked on a case that actually went to trial involving RICO. There's a civil aspect to it where you're trying to get money out of the other side. Treble damages, actually, too, and attorney's fees. It's a great law for law firms and for the right kind of case. Well, I had just come to Buffalo, having done street gangs in Washington, prosecuted. When I say done, it means I prosecuted them, including murder cases. So I kind of married the experience of prosecuting killers with the civil RICO law, used the criminal aspects, and we charged 36 men and women under this RICO statute. And we convicted everybody but one. That one person was actually under indictment when he was killed by one of the other gang members that was concerned about him. So I consider that a success because everybody was convicted. But the other aspect to that case is one of the defendants was charged with a death penalty eligible offense, Darrell Reese Johnson. He was alleged to have killed 8 people, including torture, murder, everything. One of the, I won't get into too much of the graphics, but one of the ways he killed one man is he rolled him in a rug, and then they couldn't remember which end had the person's head. So the guys with the guns decided to start shooting both ends of the rug, and kind of, I mean, that gives you an idea of some of the brutality. So that gentleman, just on the eve of trial, actually pleaded guilty, and he's now serving multiple consecutive life terms. So that was the Sly Green case, and we ended up using a lot of techniques, wiretaps, cooperation agreements with accomplices, witness security programs, which had been used for mafia figures. As a matter of fact, another interesting similarity with Robert Jackson, he actually was working and trying to pass a wiretap bill when he was United States Attorney General. The law of wiretap is a fairly recent vintage, 1960s. Before that, cops would listen in. Sometimes it would be excluded from evidence, sometimes it would be permitted. But there began to be this effort to statutize, to really put a standard down and pass a law. Robert Jackson tried to get a wiretap law passed, it didn't pass. But he also spoke on another instance in a case, I think it's known as the An Lee case. And one of the issues before the Supreme Court was whether somebody who's a convicted criminal should be prevented from testifying at a trial. And he wrote a concurrence, basically drawing on his life experiences, saying, you know what? Sometimes these criminals have the best evidence because they were actually associated with the bad guys. We should not have an automatic rule preventing criminals from testifying. Rather, let everybody with evidence, relevant evidence, testify. Let's let the defense lawyers through cross-examination try to challenge credibility. Let's let the fact finder, the jury, decide whether to use them or not. We could not have, or convict her whether to trust them or not. We could not have won the Sly Green case without the testimony of people such as Norman Workman, the former right-hand man of the gang member. And one of the things I told the jury, and I tell audiences today, is you don't necessarily go to heaven to find witnesses against the devil. And that's where the accomplices sometimes come in.
Just for the audience here, as an aside, we just recently gave an award at the International Law Dialogues to a gentleman by the name of Bill Kaming. Bill Kaming was a Nuremberg prosecutor, subsequently became general counsel to Bell Telephone. And in the 60s, he went to Congress to testify using Jackson's letter and opinion back in the 1940s, regarding the wiretap and its viability, legitimacy, et cetera. And he talks about that quite a lot. So there's a whole connect. Sly Green, he got 4 life sentences,
Yeah.
plus an additional 120 years.
And
How's he doing?
well, I don't know. Although there was a magazine that just came out in which Sly Green had, I guess, an interview. I didn't see the magazine. It's something that is published in the prison community, but I was told about it. And then the other thing I should tell you about the Sly Green, we thought we were one of the first people to use RICO against a street gang. Over the years since 1991, I've run across prosecutors and some investigators say, no, I was the first one. So I don't want to say I was the first one, but we thought we were the first one. And I think as a matter of historical accuracy, I should say we were one of perhaps others who were using it simultaneously, not necessarily speaking to each other, but just discovering that there's this tool out there.
Well, among us friends, you're first. Also, during that time, you had threats on your and your family's life. How did you handle that?
Well, the United States Marshal Service does a wonderful job, and they provide security for all court officers, so that they took care of that issue, along with the FBI as well. I became best friends with the FBI agents who worked on that case as case agents, and that's the other thing that frankly keeps me in criminal justice. You meet a lot of wonderful souls that are doing work as your law enforcement officers, police officers, agents, sheriffs, and in Tom Thurston and Glenn Rukoff, the two case agents of Sly Green, I mean, you talk and you strategize and you see them in action, and it's just wonderful. And they have talents, by the way, that I don't have. They would tell me how to ask questions in cross-examination that were just astounding. And the other skill they had, and I don't know how they do it, and I'm in awe of it, but Tom Thurston and I, this agent, were once in Memphis, Tennessee, and we were talking and laughing about something inconsequential. And Tom was parking the car, and as I got out on the passenger side, this fairly tough-looking guy came up to me, and I don't know if he was going to try to rob me or maybe just ask for money. I never learned, because without missing a beat, Tom, who was getting out of the car and still chuckling, just like that, shifted and said, and I'll never forget it, "We don't even have time for you." And he just looked at this man, and the guy just walked away and said, "Oh, okay." And I don't know how he did that and how he was able to turn on and turn off this other persona, but good investigators, they have that talent, and they can get people to confide in them. And I could tell you stories right now about one person who's in this room who's just an astounding interviewer, and there's no subterfuge. There's just conversation and an ability to connect with people that range from the highest echelons of society, the business moguls, to the lowest elements of society. And this one agent that I'm thinking of, who's here, frankly, has that talent. And because of his efforts, he solved a cold case murder from 15 years ago, where both people who committed the murder, one of whom was acquitted by a state jury, they confessed to Special Agent Brent Isaacson. So you tell me how that happened.
You just talked about confiding and obtaining the confidence. Another big case of yours really dealt with the Local 91 members in Niagara Falls, which I'm sure required all of those skills.
That was a challenging case, because it almost shows what could happen if crime goes unchecked. What had happened in Niagara County was there was about 20 members of a 650-member local that had so much power that they were able to approach anybody who wanted to do any kind of construction work in Niagara County for about 30 years and give them one of two choices. You could either hire our people, or you're not going to be able to do the job. Well, most people, if you're from out of town, if you were from in town, you knew what that meant, and you would hire the people. Even if you didn't want them, even if you couldn't use them, you had to hire them. And there was, frankly, no place to go, no place to hide if you wanted to get a job done. This particular group had a stranglehold on construction sites, and you just didn't know where the threat would come from, but something would happen. What would happen would be discovered by the out-of-town companies who would say, I'm a non-union company, or I'm a union company and I've got more than enough people, thank you. In that case, the threats would begin perhaps with your tires being punctured as you try to get to work. You might be followed home, and that can be intimidating for some people. Other people who might still continue to insist on their right to run their project the way they want might be beaten up. And finally, in the case of 4 workers from New Jersey who came to do a asbestos removal project, you would have explosives thrown into your apartment as you slept. So it was a very intimidating environment for the poor folks. And it didn't just affect the construction trades. Development stopped. So literally, some people, when they go up to Niagara, or if you went up to Niagara County up until this prosecution, you might have asked yourself, why is Niagara County like this when across the river it's like that? And one of the reasons would have been that there was no construction that would happen without somebody having to spend almost 30% more, give or take, to get your project finished ultimately, or else not finished at all. So as a result of that prosecution, we convicted the 20 people, actually 19 out of the 20. One person was found not guilty, actually, in that trial. So he was alleged to have attacked a truck driver as part of a larger attack. The Niagara County Legislature actually is the group that brought some of these consequences to bear, and they're one of the groups that awarded the prosecution team and the investigators. And I've got to tell you, as a federal prosecutor with U.S. Marshal and FBI protection, I lead a charmed life. Nobody would really want to do anything against a prosecutor because the wrath of God literally would come down on them. Not so for the local officers who helped us, because 650-member local, they have brothers and sisters that are working in different industries, including in law enforcement. And there was a very brave local law enforcement, City of Niagara Falls police officer, and a very brave deputy county sheriff that really ended up making the case every step of the way with us, along with an FBI agent, Department of Labor agent. And that is a challenge because they lived right in the community too. So you can't be up 24 hours a day. Some of you may say to yourselves, you know, I've got a gun, which of course your legal right. I can guard my own house, my castle. You don't realize until somebody can be anywhere that it's tough to be 100% safe. And that's why my hats always go off to these 2 local officers, Bill Thompson and Mike Messina, just tremendous officers. And also had this ability to really find witnesses and get them to cooperate.
Before I draw closure, probably about 5 minutes for questions.
One question, Mike. The district attorney's office throughout the country have victim and witness advocates. Do your agencies have witness and victim advocates who work with victims?
We do. Sharon Knope is our victim witness coordinator. She does a tremendous job. But yes, we have an advocate who will come to court with some of these fraud victims or child cases. We seldom handle just straight violent crime cases like the district attorneys. Under our system, the district attorneys do the vast majority of street-level crime. We do the more organized, multi-district crime. That being said, we've had a case with a rape victim that Ms. Nope went to court with, and other kinds of highly sensitive cases, and she's wonderful. She's trained, she's a professional, and people speak very highly of our victim witness coordinator. Very important role.
Yes, Stan. Our chairman, by the way, chairman of the board.
Wonderful.
During your wife Kathy's campaign, my wife Sarah said, "Do I know her?" And I said, "Yeah, she's a softball player." She played with the Voss Lundin NOLAC team. So you weren't the only softball player in DC, but we actually call it the Lundin Voss. But I'm not going to ask you a softball question. Recently, the Buffalo News gave a report that you had charged more death penalty charges than any U.S. attorney, I think, in the country. Would you like to comment?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, that story just didn't get the facts right. There's no doubt that since I've been the United States Attorney, we have solved 13 murders that are attributed to violent street gangs because we've made that one of our priorities, including the one here in Jamestown and the attempted murder here. Many other murders as well. And we've worked on other murders too, but 13 murders we've identified and charged, the grand jury's charged, as being part of violent narcotics trafficking or killing of a federal witness cases. And that's a large number, there's no doubt about it. Under Department of Justice policy, if somebody is charged with that kind of murder, there is the possibility, it's only a possibility, but there is a possibility that there could be, down the road, a death penalty question for a jury to decide. But to get to that road, the Attorney General himself has to say, this case is deserving of seeking the death penalty. We are not at that stage at any of our cases. We have solved 13 murders, attributed them to gang or retaliation motives, so they could carry the death sentence. Now, once they can carry the death sentence, even if it's remote, and I should say that of the 24 men we've accused of committing these 13 murders, the Attorney General has already said in more than half of them, we're not going death penalty. So the universe, the pool has declined, and he hasn't ruled at all on the others. So right now we have no real death penalty cases. But if it does carry a possibility, it's a statutory requirement. It's not Bill Hochul requirement. There's a statutory requirement that the judge does have to assign a second lawyer. It's called learned counsel, somebody who's familiar with, if it ever goes this way, how to handle that kind of case. And it's the existence of that second lawyer that I think led the Buffalo News to conclude, at least in its title or subtitle, that maybe it's been an expensive result in having this many cases. But I go back to what's inside the article, and that is this. Even if the numbers are accurate, and the Buffalo News says that all of these 24 cases have resulted in approximately $600,000 more costs. I don't know how they got to that number, by the way, because I can't get that number, and I work with some of these very sensitive authorities I told you about, and I have no idea. And I can tell you that whether they were charged with death penalty or not, everybody's entitled to a lawyer. They would at least have had one lawyer at taxpayer expense. But even if you take the $600,000 as a valid number, the article goes on to say that the Erie and Niagara County crime rate has dropped 25%, whereas statewide it's a 4% reduction. And I can tell you that in Monroe County, the other place where we've been very persistent in tracking down these killers, they've had a similar decline in their violent crime episodes. And what the public would need to ask is, even if you have to spend a little bit more in affording an accused his rights to a lawyer, which Jackson very much would have supported, by the way. At Nuremberg even, there was some effort prior to Nuremberg, let's just take them outside and kill them. They don't need trials at all. And then even once they agreed they should at least go to trial, the Russians said, well, let's have them presumed guilty. And Jack, no way. They're getting good lawyers, and they're getting the best, frankly, the best lawyers, and they're going to have a real trial. I would say to you, under our American system of justice, that $600,000 is still a good investment for you to have those second lawyers there, because the violent crime has dropped so dramatically by us identifying the worst of the worst and prosecuting them. And there's really almost no way to quantify the price, the value to the public in being able to walk down the street, or being able to sit on your porch, or not having to worry when your kid goes to school in the morning. Each of these scenarios were ones that, prior to our taking a good hard look at violent crime, could have resulted in a casualty, because each of those you'll recognize from the news as sometimes somebody doing homework in an upstairs bedroom struck by a stray bullet and killed. So the resulting decrease in violence has certainly been, I would say, a justifiable investment of that $600,000. But here's the other thing you've got to realize. And that's why I don't know where the news was going. It's not your money that pays my salary. It's the United States government that pays my salary. Some of it comes from taxes. Some of it comes from import fees. Some of it comes from other duties and obligations. And frankly, a substantial amount of it comes from the bad guys themselves. That's where the $600,000 is coming from. What am I talking about? Well, my budget, you can look it up, is give or take, for all my, I have over 120 people in our office. Our operating budget is about $10 million. Last year, my office brought in $28 million as a result of fines and forfeitures. This year, we're just getting ready to release our report, and we are bringing back over $23 million to the Treasury just by prosecutions, the seizures in the cases of $500,000 of drug proceeds. So I just, for the life of me, don't know where that article came from. But I've got to say that it's my duty to uphold the law. And I will, if there's a statute, and Congress was the one, frankly, who passed the law calling for punishment for drug-related or gang-related murders. If Congress changes that law, there will be no chance of a death sentence. And I realize it's a topic that may have different opinions among the population. In a democracy, those kinds of debates are settled on the House and Senate floors. The law right now says they could carry the death sentence. The Attorney General is the one who decides, though, whether I can even seek it. And then finally, it's the judge and jury who decides finally to impose it. And it has to be unanimous, 12-0, not only to convict, a whole separate sentencing phase, 12-0 for the death penalty in federal court. So it's somewhat of a rare occurrence, really. And at any step of the way, if a defendant pleads guilty, as did Darrell Reese Johnson, that's the end of it.
Fred, then the last one will be.
Spoken a number of times tonight about drugs in one way or another. A few weeks ago, PBS showed Ken Burns' production on Prohibition, where the criminal justice system was turned to stop millions of Americans from doing what they wanted to do. As a result of Prohibition, we got organized crime and all kinds of unintended bad consequences. What lessons, if any, do you see from your life's work with Prohibition
Well, certainly when it came to the organized crime elements which emerged from Prohibition, they continued to be threats well into the 80s and 90s. As a matter of fact, the boss of all bosses, the ruler of the commission, if you will, was Stefano Magaddino, who was based in Niagara Falls. So there were consequences from Prohibition that we in Western New York felt firsthand. As far as the war on drugs is concerned, I really can't weigh into on that debate in my role. I just enforce the law. It's up to the legislature and the electorate who votes the legislators and the congresspeople in to decide which way to go on that. But I can say this: Samantha, the girl I told you about who spoke at our prescription pill conference and who admitted she's been clean for 5 months now, before that time, descending into the depths of heroin and really being exposed to just a terrible, terrible life, began that descent with marijuana, and then it went to prescription pills. I can also tell you that prescription pills themselves are legal. They're in our medicine cabinets, and they serve good purpose. They address pain, and they're administered by licensed professionals. And yet we see a lot of consequences with people misusing even legal substances. And then the last thing I'll say is there has been now in a variety of states actual legalization of certain kinds of drugs. So one of the advantages of our system of government, we do have 50 different laboratories at the state level where different policies can be explored and adopted according to the will of the legislature. And I think all of us will be in a better position with all of this information at our hand to make the best decision possible.
Last one, Sally?
Well, actually, it was about the article in the paper. Two questions on that. So you think there was a direct relationship between your requesting looking into death penalty and the going down of violent crimes?
Well, not my view, the view of the two police commissioners that were interviewed, both Commissioner Dorenda, Commissioner Dorenda, and also, I don't think he uses the title Commissioner, Superintendent John Cella. Both attributed the decline to our office's efforts. I would say that based on my experiences, that it is a small percentage of people that commit a disproportionate amount of crime, that if you can get the right people charged, it does have a tremendous impact. And I do attribute the people that we are charging and convicting, frankly, because we've convicted, in addition to the 24 people we've charged with capital offenses, we've charged dozens of other gang members, 30 in one case alone. So I think collectively that's making an impact. And going back to the Sly Green case that Greg spoke to me about, the murder rate when we began that investigation was 88 murders in the city of Buffalo. After we convicted and prosecuted, or actually even charged the Sly Green crew, murder rate dropped in half, 50%. And the then police commissioner, or maybe he was in charge of the intelligence division, he said it was because of the Sly Green prosecution that the crime rate went down. So that motivated me and provided firsthand evidence that we do have to be spending time in this area.
I thought it also implied that while, and I don't know what words to use, requesting the death penalty possibility for these people, it also held up their trials and so forth, and that also cost money. Well, I don't know.
Well, yeah, it does slow down the process, but not at our request. What happens is, anytime anybody's indicted, they have the right to go to trial within 70 days, and we can't ask, really, to slow that speedy trial law down. However, defense lawyers almost always, and in Western New York, in my experience, always ask for more time, because that Speedy Trial Act protects their clients in the sense that the lawyers can get prepared, they can study our evidence, they can try to challenge in different kinds of pretrial proceedings, our use of techniques. And in the case of the death penalty, defense lawyers have been asking for 6 months in order to do their own investigation into the backgrounds of the accused and develop what is called mitigation evidence. Because if someday there is a death penalty case, when you get to the sentencing phase, which only you get to if there's a conviction on one of these very specialized counts, then the defense has all kinds of rights and powers and abilities to introduce lots of evidence.
Which they have to collect before
That they,
it's even said that there can be a death penalty.
yeah, they don't necessarily have to do it before, but in our experience, they've been asking to do it at the front end. And of course, that it inures to the benefit of the defense, so our prosecutors agree to delay for generally as long as defense lawyers want. I say generally, because if the requests get too extreme or too remote, we want a year. It's been my experience that delay works to the advantage of the defense, because when we indict, I told you the high standard we have internally. We don't indict, we don't charge unless we have evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. We're almost ready to go at the moment we charge. We could go to, we know our case. The defense lawyers don't. So understandably, they want time to learn about our case and to formulate a defense, which is fine, and I applaud that, and it should happen. Everybody should have a vigorous defense. However, after a reasonable amount of time, the witnesses that maybe a year earlier remembered the accused was wearing a blue shirt, or he was 10 feet away, and he said, "Now I've got you." Suddenly the memories fade. If you're using former accomplices, they may themselves have been attacked and harmed, or they may have gone back into the criminal milieu. You can't even find them. Or they might have picked up some other bad habits, drug addiction of their own, alcohol abuse. Any number of things can operate against the government as the clock continues to run. And most importantly, the public has the right to a speedy trial as well. The public has the right to know whether or not the crime has been solved or not. And if a community has to wait a year, 2 years, in the case of the Gaspar family, whose son was murdered in 1996, they had to wait 14 years because Cheryl Gaspar had been acquitted. So as far as the Gaspar family knew, the killer was still on the loose for 14 years. Try living with yourself as the surviving family members with that. Delay does could hurt the community, and thanks to the work of Agent Isaacson and the others in our office as well, and the county sheriffs, there was closure. So there is delay with these cases, no doubt, but it's at the defense request.
The qualities of a good prosecutor, as defined by Robert Jackson in 1940, are as elusive and as impossible to define as those which mark a gentleman. And those who need to be told would not understand it anyways. A sensitiveness to fair play and sportsmanship is perhaps the best protection against the abuse of power. And the citizen's safety lies in the prosecutor, who tempers zeal with human kindness, who seeks truth and not victims, who serves the law and not factional purposes, and who approaches his task with humility. As for one, Robert Jackson has just defined U.S. Attorney Bill Hochul. And I thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you, Greg.
Attention, boys and